"My baby is dead," she whispered. The words barely left her lips, but they struck like a bell inside the quiet barn. A 24-year-old Japanese nurse, cradling her swollen belly, sat on a rusted cot as her hands trembled. The child she carried, conceived in war, nurtured through famine, hadn't moved in days. The guards thought she was faking. The other women avoided her. She had come to this dusty Texas camp expecting punishment. Now she waited for death. But then the cowboy arrived. His boots echoed across the wooden floor. His belt creaked as he knelt beside her. He wasn't a doctor, just a rancher with blood on his hands from cattle, not war. Yet when she clutched his arm, whispering, "Please," something shifted in him. He didn't speak her language. He didn't need to. Within the hour, he had her on a stretcher. A surgery table was cleared. The child inside her, thought dead, would soon cry its first breath into a world she no longer understood. The wind carried the heat of the Texas plains through the open gate, swirling dust into the corners of the camp road as the truck came to a lurching stop. Akiko Nakamura didn't move at first. She sat stiffly, eyes lowered, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her fingers trembled, but her face remained still, expressionless in a way that unnerved the guards. When the door creaked open, she stepped down slowly, her steps small and hesitant, as if her feet might shatter from touching American soil. Her boots were too large. The laces trailed like broken promises. Around her, other women from the transport clung to their bags, whispering in Japanese. Akiko said nothing. She had nothing to cling to, not a bag, not a companion. Only the secret inside her. She was 6 months pregnant, though no one had noticed yet. Her body was too thin, her uniform too loose. The hunger of the past year hollowing her into something barely recognizable as a woman, let alone an expecting mother. Her belly, once beginning to round, had retreated under the pressure of fear and famine. Even she sometimes forgot the baby was there. But at night, lying on the straw mat in the corner of the barracks, her hands would drift down, seeking a flicker of movement. Just one tiny nudge to remind her she was still carrying life. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, she would close her eyes and try to feel nothing. The guards didn't ask questions. They called out names, assigned numbers, and motioned toward assigned bunks. One American, tall, sunburned, reeking faintly of tobacco, glanced twice at Akiko's profile, but moved on. They were told to watch for resistance, not weakness. They expected rage or subversion, not the dull silence of a woman who wouldn't meet their gaze. To them, she was just another enemy body. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, soap, and sour bedding. The women were given wool blankets, dented tin bowls, and the names of the nearest latrines. Akiko moved like a ghost between the beds, claiming the smallest cot near the window. No one spoke to her. A few glanced at her stomach and quickly looked away. Word traveled faster than wind in a place like this. She heard them whisper, "She came alone." No luggage. She never eats much. She stares at the ceiling for hours. Some thought she was simple. Others thought she was cursed. No one asked what she carried. The truth was, she had no name for what was inside her. The baby's father was gone, lost to the flames of surrender or perhaps buried beneath the rubble of a ruined hospital. He had been cruel, but not unusually so, just another officer who treated nurses like supplies. She had learned not to flinch, not to speak, not to want. Carrying the child had been less a choice than a continuation of orders, of silence, of survival. What would be the point of telling anyone? No one had cared in Japan. Why would they care in Texas? Days. Mo passed. She ate little. The camp food, bread, beans, sometimes something resembling meat, tasted wrong in her mouth. The baby seemed to move less. Then, one night, she awoke suddenly, heart pounding. She had dreamed of water, dark and deep, and of sinking. Her hands flew to her stomach. Nothing. She pressed harder, shifted to her side, waited, listened. Nothing. She sat up, dizzy, the blanket sliding off her shoulders. The woman on the cot beside her snored softly. Outside, the crickets droned in a slow, indifferent chorus. Akiko clutched her belly. She whispered in Japanese, a prayer, or maybe a plea. "Move, please, move." The silence inside her was louder than any bomb she had ever heard. Before she ever stepped onto American soil, Akiko had already buried versions of herself in the ruins of Japan. Her father, a factory foreman in Nagoya, died when she was 15, lungs shredded by smoke and steel, a casualty not of bullets but of empire. Her mother shrank beneath the weight of widowhood, boiling weeds and bark to stretch the rice. Her brother disappeared into the army with a promise. "I'll bring honor home." He never did. His last letter arrived a week before the bombing started, ink smeared by rain, the word endure underlined 3 times. Akiko did. She endured in silence. That was her only shield. At 17, she was conscripted as a field nurse in a military hospital south of Osaka. The white smock didn't stay clean long. She wiped the blood of boys barely older than her, folded soiled sheets, stitched wounds without morphine. She learned to carry metal basins of vomit with a steady hand, to walk past the screaming with her eyes fixed forward. The officers barked orders between drags of cigarettes. They didn't learn the nurses' names. When one placed his hand on her back and led her into the supply closet, she didn't resist. She didn't cry. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard it bled. That was how the baby began. She told no one. There was no one to tell. One other nurse, a girl with a scar across her collarbone, guessed. She left half her rice ball under Akiko's pillow that night and never spoke of it. The rest of the staff never looked close enough to notice. Her belly remained flat for months, starved into obedience. Her body wasn't a cradle, it was a battlefield. Still, the child survived inside her, a tiny echo of something she couldn't name. When the surrender was announced, the hospital collapsed into chaos. Some nurses wept, others screamed. The officers who had once marched the halls with medals vanished. The soldiers burned records, tore insignia from their uniforms, tried to blend into the dust. Akiko folded her apron, set it gently on a cot, and walked barefoot out the door. The empire had fallen. No one stopped her. She was rounded up near the coast days later. A transport ship waited, gray and silent, its decks watched by American soldiers in stiff uniforms. She expected cages, shackles. The baby kicked once during processing, a slow, sluggish motion like a fish beneath ice. She placed a hand over her stomach. No one noticed. The ship rocked with the rhythm of the sea, foreign and constant. Below deck, the women slept in iron bunks. The lights flickered. Meals came on trays, strange bread, canned peaches, something sweet and wrong. Akiko ate little. The baby stopped moving again. Some of the women murmured prayers at night. Others whispered rumors. The Americans would force abortions, sterilize them, turn them into experiments. Akiko said nothing. She curled on her side and stared at the bolts on the ceiling. Days passed in a fog. The guards didn't beat them. They didn't even yell. They gave out blankets, soap, water. It made no sense. The enemy was not supposed to be kind. The enemy was supposed to punish. When the ship finally docked, a soldier offered Akiko his hand to help her off the ramp. She flinched. He looked confused but said nothing. The Texas air hit her like a furnace, dry, hot, full of dust and hay. She didn't know where she was. She didn't ask. She was led off the dock like cattle, her shoes too loose, her belly heavier than fear. That night, in her new barracks, she stared at the wooden slats of the ceiling and whispered one word to the baby inside her. Endure. For days, Akiko lived by that word. She whispered it under her breath while folding her blanket each morning, while scraping tasteless beans into her mouth, while pressing her palm gently to her belly in search of movement. Every shift, every nudge, every small flutter of life was a miracle she did not deserve but dared to hope for. The baby's kicks had become her secret prayer, proof that even in captivity something within her refused to surrender. When it moved, she felt less like a prisoner, more like a mother. But then came the morning when there was nothing. It was a Tuesday. The sun had risen, brutal and unfeeling, casting long bars of light across the barrack floors. Akiko sat up slowly, her hand sliding under the thin fabric of her dress. She waited. Her breath caught. She tapped her stomach gently, then a little harder. Still nothing. No rolls, no nudges, no stubborn jab beneath her ribs. Her skin felt cold, her throat tight. She whispered the baby's name, the one she had never said aloud, the one she hadn't even decided was real. Yuki. It meant snow, a word for silence, a word for purity, a word for something already vanishing. By mid-morning, she could no longer pretend it was just exhaustion. She rose shakily and stepped out into the harsh light. The ground was dry, cracked, impatient beneath her feet. She crossed the yard to the wire gate and waited until a guard passed by. A young man with a forgettable face and sweat soaking through his collar. She lifted her hand, then hesitated. English was a knot in her mouth, but she tried. "No move," she said, pointing to her belly. "Baby, no move." The guard frowned. "You sick?" She nodded. "Inside. No move." He shrugged, annoyed. "Go to the medic," he said, and walked away. She did. Her feet felt like stone, her heart thudding as if to replace the absent rhythm inside her. The camp clinic was a repurposed barn, its doors wide, a red cross painted crookedly on a plank above the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of iodine and horses. A single table, a few shelves of supplies, and a medic, older than most, with spectacles sliding down his nose and a pencil tucked behind his ear. Akiko stepped forward. She pointed again. "Baby, no move." He barely looked up. "We don't do maternity," he muttered. She moved closer, desperation cracking her voice. "Please, baby, no move. I think dead." He sighed, flipping a page in his ledger. "We'll have a doctor make rounds next week. Maybe he can check." She blinked. "Next week?" "Yeah. Now get some rest." Tears blurred her vision, but she bowed anyway because habit still held power. She turned and stumbled back outside, swallowing a scream that burned behind her teeth. The air was hotter now. The camp buzzed with routine, guards patrolling, women scrubbing laundry, trays clattering in the mess hall. No one noticed her panic. No one cared. Until someone did. A voice cut across the yard. "Hey!" Akiko turned, startled. A man stood in the shadow of the stables, cowboy hat low, shirt rolled to the elbows, boots caked in dust. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't carry a gun. He walked toward her like he'd just stepped out of a painting she didn't understand. "You all right, miss?" he asked, squinting. She didn't know the words, but she knew the tone. He pointed to her stomach. She nodded. "No move." He looked past her, toward the clinic, then back. "And they didn't do nothin'?" She shook her head. "No, they say, wait, next week." He stared at her for a long second, then spit into the dirt. "Hell no." And before she could stop him, before she could even process the kindness cracking through her fear, he turned on his heel and marched straight into the clinic, his boots hitting the wood like thunder. Thomas Reddick wasn't a medic, and he sure as hell wasn't supposed to intervene. He was a rancher with a sidearm and a clipboard, stationed at the camp because he knew how to ride, shoot straight, and stay quiet when the officers talked policy. But he'd seen enough death in his own life to know what it looked like creeping up behind someone. And in Akiko's face, he saw it, not just fear, but the hollowness of someone preparing to say goodbye, not to herself, to something smaller, something fragile. He couldn't walk past that. Inside the clinic, the medic didn't even look up when Thomas stormed in. "Already told her," the man grumbled. "We don't handle pregnancies here." Thomas's voice came out low and sharp. "Then find someone who does." "She's the enemy," the medic snapped. "Not our responsibility." Thomas leaned over the table, eyes narrowed. "She's a human being, and if that baby's still alive, you're gonna help me save it." It wasn't a request. Within minutes, he had Akiko on a stretcher made from a mess hall bench and 2 old flags. Someone brought clean water from the well. Another woman, trembling but determined, boiled sheets in a pot used for stew. The kitchen was cleared, tables pushed aside. A lantern was hung from the ceiling beam, casting flickering light across the room. Akiko lay on a mattress of hay and blankets, her eyes wide, mouth pressed shut. She didn't understand the words being spoken around her, but she understood the urgency in their voices. The barn had become a strange theater, part clinic, part battlefield. Men moved with the stiff panic of people trying to remember lessons they were never taught. One guard fetched a knife from the cook's drawer. Thomas cleaned it with whiskey and wrapped the handle in cloth. He had used it once to cut a horse's throat when it shattered a leg in a prairie gopher hole. Now it might be used to bring life into the world. Thomas knelt beside Akiko. His hands trembled as he placed them on her belly. They smelled of saddle leather, tobacco, and horses, warm, dry, undeniably alive. She flinched. Then she didn't. Her eyes searched his face, not for understanding, but for steadiness. He didn't smile, just nodded once. That was enough. She whispered something in Japanese. He didn't know the meaning, but the tone was clear. "Do what you must." Outside, the sky dimmed. The heat of the day gave way to an uneasy stillness, and just as Thomas was about to make the first cut, headlights swept across the barn wall. A truck skidded to a halt. Boots pounded the dirt. A voice shouted, "Make room!" A local doctor, summoned by a furious call from a junior officer, entered in a rush, gray-haired, sleeves rolled, still smelling of antiseptic and road dust. He took one look at the setup and scowled. "Jesus," he muttered. "You were really gonna do this?" Thomas stood up, jaw set. "Damn right I was." The doctor knelt, peeled back the blanket, and examined Akiko with practiced hands. "We don't have time for transport. She's going septic. Baby might already be gone." He looked around. "Boil more water. Get me gloves. This is gonna get loud." Akiko's breath hitched. Her hand reached out blindly. Thomas took it, calloused fingers closing around hers. She gripped him like a rope thrown into a flood. He didn't let go. Not when the doctor made the first incision, not when Akiko screamed into her sleeve, not when the silence in the barn stretched long enough to feel eternal. He just held her hand and prayed. The knife slid through skin as the doctor muttered instructions no one else dared to speak aloud. Akiko didn't scream. She bit down on a folded cloth rag, soaked with whiskey and fear. Her eyes locked on the ceiling beams above her, but they didn't see them. They saw rice paddies and snow, her mother's hands, her brother's letters. They saw the absence of a future. Blood darkened the sheets beneath her as the doctor worked fast, slicing through layers of tissue with the ruthless precision of someone who had stopped counting miracles. Thomas stood at her side, drenched in sweat, gripping her hand like it was all that tethered him to the ground. She squeezed back, her knuckles white, her strength defiant. The smell in the barn had changed, metallic, thick, primal. Somewhere in the corner, a young guard vomited into his own helmet. No one acknowledged it. Scalpel, the doctor snapped. Clamp, suction. The room blurred around the edges. Akiko's breaths came in short, ragged bursts. Her other hand clawed at the blanket, gathering it into her fist. She felt her body tilt between worlds, here and not here, pain and numbness, holding on and letting go. And then a sound that did not belong in war. The doctor swore. Cords tight, wrapped around the neck. He reached deeper, his brow knotted. Come on, little one. A sickening wet sound, the rustle of cloth, a silence too sharp to bear. He lifted the child into the lantern light, limp, blue, still. No one moved, not the guards, not the nurse who'd arrived late, not Thomas, whose grip on Akiko's hand suddenly loosened. Akiko turned her head weakly. Her eyes found the shape in the doctor's arms. Her lips moved around no breath at all. And then, so faint it could have been imagined, a cough, followed by a sputter, followed by a cry, high, piercing, furious, the kind of cry that demands the world take notice, the kind of cry that rips through history and plants its flag on the soil of the living. The barn exhaled. The nurse sobbed. One of the guards muttered something like a prayer. The doctor barked orders with a grin cracking his face open. Blankets, hot water. Let's keep her breathing. Akiko didn't smile. She couldn't. Her body had given everything. Her lips trembled, her eyes fluttered. And then, just before the darkness took her, she whispered in Japanese, She's alive. Her head rolled to the side. Her grip on Thomas's hand went slack. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, his free hand covering his face. His shoulders heaved, silent at first. Then not. He wept like a man who had held back for too long, not just for Akiko, not just for the child, for the war, for the waste, for everything he hadn't been able to save before this moment. The baby was wrapped in warm cotton, tiny fists flailing, mouth open in protest at her own arrival. She didn't know what her cry meant. She didn't know the line it had crossed. But the people around her did. In that barn, under that lantern, the war fell quiet. Not outside. The headlines still burned with battles and surrenders and lists of the dead. But in that room, something larger had won. Not a side, not a flag, a breath, a heartbeat, a cry that said, I am here. And for the first time since she had been taken, since she had whispered, endure, into silence, Akiko Nakamura was not alone. She woke slowly, as if rising through deep water. The pain came first, dull, heavy, anchored low in her body. But it no longer frightened her. Pain meant she was still here. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, rough-hewn wood instead of hospital plaster or barrack slats. Sunlight filtered through a small window, dust motes floating like pale insects in the air. Somewhere nearby, she heard a sound that pulled her fully into consciousness. A cry. Not the screaming of men, not the crack of gunfire, not the echo of commands. A small, insistent cry. Akiko turned her head, her neck stiff, her breath catching when she saw the bundle beside her. a tiny shape wrapped tightly in an olive-green blanket, stamped with faded letters she could not read. The cloth swallowed the child almost entirely, but a pink face peeked out, scrunched and furious at the world. The sound was real, impossible, alive. Her daughter. Akiko's hands shook as she reached out. Her fingers brushed the blanket, then the soft skin beneath it. Warm, solid, real. A sound escaped her throat, something between a laugh and a sob. Tears blurred her vision, spilling freely now, without restraint or shame. She pressed her lips to the child's forehead and whispered the name she had carried in secret for months. Yuki. Snow. She chose it because snow fell without asking permission, because it survived the heat by being itself, because it arrived quietly and still changed the world it touched. Yuki had been born into stillness, into a moment where everyone had stopped breathing, waiting to see if life would return. And it had. Word spread quickly through the camp, not shouted, not announced, just passed in glances and murmurs. The guards who had once walked past Akiko without a second look now slowed when they passed the clinic door. One tipped his hat, another nodded, awkward but sincere. No one barked orders near her bed. The air around her had changed. The women came next. At first, they lingered at the doorway, uncertain. One stepped inside with a folded scrap of bread hidden in her sleeve. Another brought half a boiled potato, still warm, wrapped in cloth. A third offered a strip of clean fabric for bandages. They said little. They didn't need to. Their gestures spoke of something unspoken but shared. Recognition. The baby had shifted something inside them, too. Yuki became a quiet center in the camp, a small orbit that pulled people closer without asking. Women who had avoided Akiko before now paused to watch the child sleep. Some asked gently if they could hold her. Akiko nodded when she could. Each time, she felt a strange mix of fear and gratitude, fear that the world might still take this miracle away, gratitude that it had not yet done so. Thomas came by once, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he belonged there. He didn't step closer. He just looked at the child, then at Akiko. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. What had happened between them lived outside language. For the first time since Japan fell, since the ship crossed the ocean, since she had been stripped of everything familiar, Akiko felt something loosen inside her chest. Not joy, not exactly, but peace. A fragile, tentative peace, like ice forming on water that had never been still before. She slept that night without whispering, "Endure." She didn't need to. Yuki slept too, her tiny fist curled against her mother's skin, her breathing steady and sure. Outside, the camp settled into its usual rhythms, boots on gravel, distant voices, the low hum of night insects. But inside the clinic, something new had taken root. The baby was not a symbol of surrender. She was proof of survival. And as Akiko closed her eyes, one hand resting protectively over her daughter, she understood something she had not allowed herself to believe before. The war had not taken everything from her. The next morning, the nurse returned with something bundled awkwardly under her arm, a pale blue cushion frayed at the edges. Behind her, two guards carried an old wooden rocking chair, its varnish worn and its joints creaking with every step. They had found it abandoned in a nearby farmhouse the military had long since cleared. No one asked questions, no one gave orders. They just brought it to Akiko's bedside and placed it near the window where the sunlight touched the floor like spilled gold. She stared at it for a long time, then, with slow, careful movements, she eased herself into it, wincing as her stitches pulled. Yuki stirred in the crook of her arm, but didn't cry. As the chair rocked gently beneath her, Akiko felt her body relax into the rhythm. The creak of the wood, the weight of her daughter, the smell of sunlight on cotton. It was nothing like Japan, but for the first time, it was enough. That same morning Thomas arrived with a bottle of milk tucked into a small basket. He said nothing, just nodded and placed it on the windowsill. Then he left. The next day he did the same, and the next, always at sunrise, always without a word. The milk wasn't standard rations. Akiko didn't ask where it came from. Maybe it was borrowed from the officer's kitchen, maybe from one of the cows he tended. It didn't matter. What mattered was that each day her daughter drank. Her cheeks rounded. Her cries became louder, more certain. The life she had nearly lost was now growing stronger with each breath. As Yuki thrived, Akiko began to change too. Her face, once drawn and blank, softened. Her shoulders lifted slightly when she walked. Her hands moved with purpose, not fear. And one morning, as she adjusted Yuki's blanket and caught her reflection in a shard of mirror propped against the wall, she froze. It wasn't the face of a prisoner. It wasn't the nurse who had held men's blood in her hands and flinched at every sudden sound. It wasn't the woman who had crossed an ocean expecting to die. It was a mother. She touched her own cheek as if confirming it was truly hers. Her lips parted, and without meaning to, she smiled. The other women noticed. They stopped by more often. One brought cloth diapers stitched from a worn blouse. Another offered a lullaby sung in quiet, broken Japanese. They didn't become friends. War made intimacy difficult, but they became something close, witnesses to one another's pain and to one another's resilience. Meanwhile, Thomas's visits continued. He never stepped inside. He never asked for thanks. He simply came, left the milk, and disappeared like a ghost with boots and spurs. But Akiko began to recognize his pattern, the sound of his footsteps, the rustle of his shirt, the way he lingered just a second longer each day before turning away. Sometimes she would murmur, "Thank you," after he left. Once she thought she saw him pause outside the window, hand on the brim of his hat. But he didn't turn around. The chair, the milk, the quiet kindness, they became a rhythm, a ritual, a new kind of survival that didn't rely on silence and submission, but on something warmer, deeper. The war still loomed beyond the fence lines. Letters still arrived listing names of the dead. But inside that small room, a mother rocked her child, and the future, once unimaginable, now stirred with possibility. Tomorrow would come, and for the first time, Akiko was ready to meet it. The pencil felt heavier than she expected. It had been placed on the small table beside her bed without ceremony, along with a single sheet of lined paper. No guard announced it. No rule was explained. It was simply there, waiting, as if it had always belonged to her. Akiko stared at it for a long time, Yuki sleeping against her chest, the slow rise and fall of the baby's breath steadying her hands. She had been trained to follow orders, not to speak truth. Writing had always been functional. Lists, notes, charts, records meant for someone else's authority. This was different. This page had no destination, no guarantee. It might be read. It might be burned. It might disappear into a file drawer and never surface again. And yet, it demanded something from her all the same. She picked up the pencil. At first nothing came. Her mind filled with warnings she had learned young. Do not complain. Do not shame your family. Do not contradict the story you are given. The Emperor's voice still echoed faintly in her memory, distant and sacred, telling his people to endure the unendurable. She had done that. She had endured hunger, violence, surrender, Silence. Now, she wrote anyway. She did not address anyone by name, not her mother, whose fate she did not know, not the emperor, whose words no longer fit the world she inhabited. She wrote as if the page itself were listening. "They did not kill me," she wrote carefully, her hand shaking. "They saved my daughter." She paused, breath catching. Yuki stirred, then settled again. Akiko continued, the words coming easier now, as if they had been waiting for permission. She wrote about the barn, the knife, the cry that split the air open. She wrote about the cowboy who held her hand without knowing her language, and the doctor who chose to stay when he could have walked away. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not apologize. She simply told the truth. When she finished, the page felt lighter than it had before. The truth existed now, outside her body, outside her fear. Whatever happened to the letter no longer mattered. The story did not stay on the page. It traveled through the camp in quiet ways, in glances that lingered, in voices that softened, in the way guards slowed near her door. Women who had once kept their distance now approached openly, asking, sometimes in halting English, sometimes in Japanese, if they could hold the baby. Akiko said yes when she could. She watched their faces change as they cradled Yuki, their expressions caught between awe and grief. The doctor came by one afternoon, standing awkwardly near the foot of the bed. He cleared his throat and nodded toward the child. "She's strong," he said simply. Then he left, as if words beyond that might break something fragile. The camp itself did not change, the fences still stood, the routines remained. The war beyond the wire did not reverse course because one child had survived. But inside that small orbit, something shifted. The silence that had once pressed down on Akiko like a weight now loosened, becoming something gentler, something that made room for breath. Yuki became a living contradiction. She was the child of an enemy, born in captivity, wrapped in an American blanket, fed by milk carried in at dawn by a man who was never supposed to care. She embodied everything the war's stories could not explain. And because she existed, people were forced to sit with that discomfort, forced to see complexity where they had been taught to expect cruelty. Akiko understood now that bearing witness did not always require speeches or flags. Sometimes it was as simple as surviving, as holding a child up to the light and letting others see what mercy had made possible. If you are finding this story as powerful as we are, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. These stories live on because people choose to listen, and your voice is part of that remembrance. That night, Akiko folded the letter and placed it beneath Yuki's pillow. Outside, the camp settled into sleep. Inside, a mother watched her daughter dream, knowing that the world had not become kinder, but that kindness had found them anyway. By spring, the sky above Texas had begun to shift. The wind softened. The sun stayed longer each evening, and with it came a new kind of uncertainty, one wrapped not in fear of the present, but in dread of the future. Word spread quietly through the internment camp. Repatriation. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The defeated would return to their homeland. For Akiko, it was not a homecoming, it was a summons to a graveyard. She was given 2 weeks' notice. The officials handed her papers, crisp and official, with the cold neutrality of men who didn't ask what she was leaving behind, or what she might be returning to. Her body, still recovering, tensed with each step she took outside the clinic. Her heart braced against the images she could not stop seeing, the smoldering ruins of Tokyo, the empty villages, the mothers begging for rice on street corners. And Yuki, a child born of contradiction, Half imperial wound, half American mercy. A girl who breathed because a cowboy refused to follow orders. What place did such a child have in a nation scraping itself from ash? Would her grandparents even allow her through the door? Akiko didn't know, but she did know this. She would not leave her behind. In the days before departure, she said little. She wrapped Yuki in thicker blankets, stitched from donated cloth. She packed the letter, now reread so many times its folds were soft as silk, into the lining of her coat. Every night she sat in the rocking chair longer, memorizing the rhythm, as if she could carry the motion with her across the ocean. Thomas came by only once. She heard his boots before she saw him. Same as always, slow, deliberate. When she looked up, he stood just outside the doorway, his hat in his hands. He nodded toward the baby, now sitting upright in her lap, gripping a spoon like a sword. His face didn't change, his eyes didn't waver, but something hung heavy in the space between them, an unspoken knowing. Akiko rose. She stepped forward, Yuki pressed against her shoulder, and then, for the first time, she bowed. Not a polite nod, not the quick tilt of habit, a full, deep bow, the kind offered only once to someone who has changed your life. Thomas tipped his hat. He didn't speak, neither did she. Some silences mean goodbye. Others mean thank you. When the truck arrived, Akiko climbed into the back without hesitation. She held Yuki close, her small legs now stronger, her hands clutching the frayed edge of her mother's sleeve. The barbed wire gate creaked open. Guards shifted aside. Papers were checked. One woman wept softly behind her. Akiko did not look back. The truck rumbled forward. The camp, its wooden buildings, its fences, its strange mixture of cruelty and grace, began to fade into the dust. The barbed wire didn't rattle in protest. It simply let go. Beyond the gate, the road stretched long and unfamiliar. The world she was returning to no longer knew her name. But the child in her arms did. And for now, that was enough. Because stepping into the unknown is not the absence of fear. It is what you do in spite of it. And Akiko Nakamura, prisoner, mother, survivor, was no longer walking alone. She had carried silence across the ocean. Now she carried hope. The hands move with practiced calm, not fast, not slow, just certain. A woman in her 50s leans over the birthing table, sweat glistening at her brow, her voice a quiet tether in the chaos of labor. Her name is Yuki Nakamura. Her white coat is stained with the work of the day. Around her, nurses respond without question. They know her rhythm. They know when she speaks, you listen. When she is silent, you follow her lead. Another cry pierces the clinic. The baby arrives. Yuki cradles it, wipes its face, and places it on the mother's chest. She does not smile widely. She simply nods, a gesture of deep, quiet respect, and whispers the same word she once heard whispered over her: alive. The clinic sits in the outskirts of post-war Tokyo, a city still reshaping itself from ash and ambition. It is not fancy. The walls are chipped, supplies are rationed, but it is full. Life finds its way through the cracks, and Yuki is at the center of it. Above her desk hangs a single framed photograph. It is old and sun-worn, a black-and-white image of a wooden barn in Texas. In the foreground, a man in a cowboy hat holds a newborn wrapped in 2 large blankets. Next to him, a young woman lies exhausted, her eyes half open, her face both broken and whole. It is the only photo Yuki has of her birth. Her mother never spoke much about the war, but she told the story that mattered. "Before you were born," Akiko once said, "the world decided we were enemies, but one man chose otherwise. That's why you're here." As a girl, Yuki had asked about him often. What was his name? What did he do after? Akiko would always smile, trace the edge of the photograph with one finger and say, "His hands smelled like horses. That's all I remember." It was enough. Yuki grew up in a quiet part of Western Japan, raised by a woman who had been both shattered and rebuilt. Akiko worked hard, never remarried, and never spoke ill of anyone, not the Americans, not the war, not even the man who had started it all. What she passed down to her daughter was not bitterness, but resolve. Mercy had saved them, and so mercy must be given. Now Yuki gives it, every day, to the terrified mother laboring alone, to the grandmother who lost 2 sons and found hope in a grandson's first breath, to the girl who, like her own mother once did, thinks silence is her only shield. Yuki understands that healing is not always a cure. Sometimes it is a presence, a gesture, a refusal to walk away. And though her patients never know, every time she catches a baby, she silently thanks the man in the barn, the one who stayed, the one who saw not an enemy, but a woman worth saving. Mercy, she has learned, is not a moment. It is a legacy. It travels in stories, in gestures, in blood. Her hands, steady, gentle, unyielding, are her mother's hands. Her work is her mother's survival turned outward, and every child she delivers becomes a quiet continuation of a choice made decades before she was born, a choice to save instead of let go. If this story moved you, please like the video and comment below where you're watching from. These forgotten histories matter, and so do your voices, because in the end, history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember.